Hello, welcome to the IERLab Podcast. Who is IERLab? IERLab is the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab, located in Perth, Western Australia. What do? We specialise in the methodologies and the pedagogies of influencer research. I'm your host Walter Lee, coming to you all the way from South Korea to bring you, our listeners, a more in-depth look on what's going on in the world of influencer cultures. Our series will feature researchers, scholars, and students on influencer culture. Today, we'll be focusing on social media influencers and the scandals, controversy, hate, or negative attention that comes with being a larger-than-life figure. And to help us understand more is today's guest, Professor Crystal. Now, she works as a professor in Internet Studies at Curtin University. She is the director of IERLab. She has written books such as Internet Celebrity, Understanding Fame Online, Micro Celebrity Around the Globe, and the simply titled Instagram, as well as many reports, white papers, and journals. Now, Professor Crystal has also won numerous accolades, most notably the W.A. Young Tall Poppy Award 2022, the Australian Top 40 Early Career Researchers in 2021, and the ABC Top 5 Humanities Fellow 2020, just to name a few. Now, I think she's the perfect guest to start us off for our first episode today. Thank you for joining us, Professor Crystal.
Hi, Walter. This is Crystal Abidin. Thank you for starting us off. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
I'm extremely excited to chat with you today, and I'm very thankful for getting possibly the best person I can get for the podcast on our very first episode. So I'm really excited.
Thank you. We'll try our best.
Okay, so let's start off, Professor Crystal. It's hard for me to distinguish the difference between celebrities of the past, like movie stars, and social media influencers. Though influencers are met with the same negativity that celebrities have when, let's say, a controversial issue was brought up. We see it a lot more than, I guess, maybe actors, actresses, or musicians these days. But can you tell me how you came across researching influencers, the scandals, the controversy, the bad publicity, etc.? Was there a certain point in your life or influencer who sort of influenced you into studying them?
The story I always tell people is that I discovered influencers in a bathroom.
Okay.
Specifically, when I was in the bathroom in junior college, I would often hear my classmates, my cohort mates talk about so-and-so person, having gone on this date, worn this outfit, visited this kind of cafe. And I just always assumed, these must be the popular girls in our cohort that everyone just knows about. It continued into university. And at some point, I just decided to ask, who are these people? How come everybody knows them? I want to be in the loop. And as it turns out, a lot of these were simply bloggers. They were people my friends had never met. They read their updates, they are very in tune with their latest posts, their pictures, their recommendations, and they felt a very strong sense of connection and intimacy with these young women. That's how I started looking into influencers in a very detailed manner to begin with. But I started looking at the downside, the scandals, controversy, bad publicity, when during my research, I had the privilege of shadowing influencers in person, working with their managers, sitting down with them in boardrooms to do strategic planning and to mitigate issues. And in the course of my research, I found a lot of patterns with how some influencers respond to controversy. So the standard template of the apology video, but also some really interesting insights, like how sometimes the biggest scandals and controversies are actually very well-planned PR exercises. So then obviously I needed to look into that in detail as part of my research.
Do you think, this is a little question that I didn't prepare, but do you think that the controversies of, let's say, the early blogging days are far different from what you would see maybe in these days?
Oh, 100%. And I think maybe there are three main differences. In the early years, so I started looking at influencers in 2008. That was when my first project began. At that time, when we said controversy, scandal, bad publicity, they were actually these events. So they were unexpected, not anticipated. These days, we meet with a lot of skepticism. If there is a
Mm.
scandal, the first question is it really, or was it planned?
Mm. Ah.
The second thing is to do with scale. In the past, I would say that because the industry was not yet so saturated,
Mm.
whenever there was a controversy, whether it's someone in a genre or a platform in a country market that you're a fan of or not,
Mm.
word travels and people tend to know.
Mm.
These days, with the industry becoming so saturated, it's so hard to keep up that sometimes the scandals and controversies may not even register. The next thing you know, something else has eclipsed that issue.
Mm.
But I would say the biggest difference for me as someone who studies human culture and society is what constitutes a scandal or a controversy.
Mm.
Back in the day, I remember one of the biggest scandals ever was the fact that an influencer had uploaded a photograph of herself sitting on a man's lap, and it could not be verified whether that was a partner or not because the picture was quite pixelated or was quite blur.
Mm.
These days, that would probably not register on anyone's radar. It's very common behavior given the rise of selfie culture, couples branding their relationship online, influencers oversharing. So for something to register as really controversial or scandalous these days, I think the bar is set quite high. And it
Yeah.
also has to depend on what culture are we talking about? What are the mores? What is acceptable? What is still genuinely stigmatized with that kind of community online?
Find that very fascinating that we've come a long way from, like you mentioned, sitting on someone's lap and not knowing who it was as controversy. But now, obviously, things have stepped up a lot. And this sort of brings me on to my second question, because it's something that was very fascinating to me. Like, I'm on social media daily, and honestly, I hate it, but it's a part of my job as well to be somewhat, let's say, relevant in the industry that I work in. And there are certain negative trends that seem to pop up quite often, but I never have the vocab to describe it, like what these things are, these phenomenons are these days. Now, after reading your journal, Grief Hacking Influences, #Thoughts and Prayers, and the Commodification of Grief on Instagram. Now, for our listeners who don't know, can you probably just explain what grief hacking is and what spurred you on to look deeper? Was it something that upset you is the reason?
So, in general, when we have feelings about celebrities and they pass on, people, whether or not you're a fan or just someone who's appreciated one of their art pieces, their songs, their movies, etc., often would turn to social media to express grief. And if it's someone that you don't know personally, like a celebrity, the grief can range to, range from it's sad, they were talented, all the way to someone who might feel like it's a full-blown depressive meltdown coming because this person was so important to them. And this is no clearer than in the K-pop industry these days, where a lot of these idols have had a significant impact on young people with the messaging that they carry through in their songs. Influencers tend to do that too, but I studied them specific to the context of when there were natural disasters or when there was issues of violence. So for instance, a terrorist attack, a volcano, a climate change event, fire, etc. And we usually see on Instagram hashtags that occur with people saying, pray for X. X being a city or a people, or #thoughts and prayers to this region or this area. Sometimes when influencers do this expression of grief, it can feel a bit performative or like lip service, especially if they've never actually spoken about that specific social issue before, if they've never had a connection to that country, or from their post, you can see the juxtaposition of what is clearly a very vain selfie against what is meant to be like a consoling message. So people start to ask, are you really expressing grief and sharing the commiseration, or are you hijacking this trend in order to make yourself more relevant? When I dug into this more specifically, I found a very standard vocabulary. So obviously, as this trend continued through the years, some influencers became more strategic and savvy with how they wanted to insert themselves into the global grief discourse. Some people would post really, really old photos of themselves having visited that city years and years ago, and then they would exclaim panic like, oh my God, if I visited 7 years later, this
Mm,
could have been me and I could have been attacked. Or
mm,
they would say something like, oh, this natural disaster, it happened 5 kilometers away from my favorite cafe that I always go to, even though they've only visited that city once.
yeah.
So then people start to weigh this out like, hey, no, the way you're conveying your sentiments, it sounds quite self-serving. It sounds a little bit selfish. It's ultimately pointing attention back to yourself
Mm,
rather than sharing your grief and your pain with the community who's suffering.
mm,
And that was the premise of me looking into this phenomenon of grief hacking to
mm.
see how sometimes influencers are a bit tricksy in how they want to direct attention back to themselves.
Now, do you think that through your studies, maybe you looked into a little bit, did this garner a lot of negative attention from the, let's say, followers, or was it mainly positive, trying to also sympathize with what the creator was doing?
I would say initially when these sentiments were popping up on Instagram, everyone was participating in them. So for some reason, everyone has feelings about having visited Paris.
Mm,
And when the Pray for Paris attacks were circulating on Instagram, everyone had a personal story. So,
mm,
okay, fair enough. People have feelings about a touristy city that's very, very popular among people who travel there.
mm,
Then when there is competition and these influencers try to express as if they experience more grief than someone else just because the city means more to them,
mm,
then the followers get a bit annoyed and start calling them out in the comment sections and parodies and forums and threads where they start to call out influencers for just being a bit self-serving. We've moved a bit away from Instagram. Now, a lot of these practices are happening on TikTok.
mhm,
And my oh my, the call outs are just way more direct in
mm,
video replies or video duets. So the influencers do have to respond quite quickly,
mm.
as they also easily go viral as part of the call out.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. There was a sentence that I wholeheartedly agree with in regard to remembering the dead or remembering these sort of situations. And you said, while there are now more ways to remember the dead, they are also fast becoming forgotten. And it makes so
Mm.
much sense given the short form social media, like you said, TikTok these days, where we're just scrolling as we read, right? We don't even really take that much time to look at some of the content. So this is a multi-layered question. I want to know like why you think that influencers tend not to shy away from talking about grief in their lives. And do you see this as public becoming desensitized to real world issues and the importance of tragedies and death? And just in your own opinion, do you think it has lessened the meaning of death, tragedies, etc., and will be harder for younger generations to process emotionally when someone closest to them, let's say, passes away?
It's a lot in here for sure. I think you're quite right in that in general, influencers sort of like leaders that
Mm,
help shape what the next generation feels is permissible on the internet,
mm,
or what the barometers and benchmarks are for, what you can and cannot say, what you should and should not feel. So to answer your first question, like why do influencers tend not to shy away from talking about grief? I think for the most part, we need to first isolate the genre.
mm,
If you're talking about lifestyle influencers or YouTubers who tend to do talking vlogs a day in their life, they generally share highlights, summaries, snippets of their daily lives with their viewers that
mm,
include both the highlight reel and also the low light reel.
mm,
And so, if a very, very serious issue happens in their lives, like the loss of someone close to them,
mm,
it's going to be very common for them to also narrate that as part of
mm,
their update. Sometimes because they genuinely feel their online community of followers and readers
mm,
uh, are owed this level of transparency, or they feel the rapport. Other times, influencers do it because they want to stay true to themselves and not only show their best face forward.
mm,
But there is a darker side to this where sometimes I think we may not be able to cleanly or finely judge in the moment what is appropriate for sharing.
mhm,
So sometimes some influencers in that spirit tend into oversharing. For
mm,
instance, sharing without consent, a picture or a video of a very aged grandparent in hospice care. And that's
mm,
not a person who's going to be able to consent. to being demonstrated to your hundreds and thousands or even more millions of followers. In other times, they might talk about grief of people that are not immediately close to them. So maybe someone who is a child of their good friend, someone who is a sibling of a cousin, or some multi-layered kinship where they're not the immediate closest person who has the ability to make the decision over whether or not this grief can be public. And that's where you run into issues of offending your loved ones because you're publicizing their lives just by sheer proximity of them being someone in your milieu. We've definitely seen this with influencers who have undergone, say, breakups or divorces and they co-parent. Sometimes when they continue with their influencer careers, one parent overshares about a child, their trauma, their loss, and the other parent has not consented to that or has not even been able to check if their kid is okay. So in general, there is some value in influencers allowing us to have vocabularies to talk about pain, grief, the less pretty aspects of life. And we do owe it to these influencers to diversify our expectations beyond the Instagram perfect world. On the other hand, it can sometimes go a bit too far. And we do need to have a more moderated discussion about the mores of online behavior.
That is quite interesting, which kind of leads me to my next question. I want to go straight into controversy surrounding the, let's say, the objectification of women. Okay, so I felt like these days, as a society, I thought we were making a lot of progress in the objectification of women. However, with social media, I feel like we have sort of stepped back a little. Like constant images of sexualization of both men and women is some young students' first encounter with sexual education, especially if we're talking about in the terms of countries that do not promote or do not teach proper forms of sexual education. Now, in your paper, Sex Talk on Commercial Blogs as Informal Sexual Education, you talked about a personal and indoor sexuality education being using the tactics of shock and allure. Now, for example, I want to talk about the Holly Jean caught in bed with Ang Mo Man, I believe that's pronounced, the situation. Can you briefly tell us about what that was?
Sure. So for people who might be unacquainted with sexuality education in a country like Singapore or in many other markets in Southeast Asia, this is a topic that is still a growing conversation in schools. Some schools address it. Some governments do not have a mandate that schools have to teach sexual education. But even among the schools who do teach it, there's a lot of debate over what version of sexual education do you give to young people? Is it abstinence only? Do you teach them just from a health perspective? Do you teach them sex positivity because young people are going to have sex anyway? So it is against this backdrop that several years ago, I found this really interesting viral trend from day one and followed it so closely. Holly Jean was one of the first sex positive bloggers I found in my research. Really good lifestyle writer, great magazine writer, always really measured and thoughtful with her words. And then one day there was a viral video that appeared as if she was caught in bed with a white man. So that's what the Ang Mo refers to colloquially. It was really sloppily shot. It looked like someone was literally doing this through a hidden cam exercise. And there was no, conclusion to it. So a couple of days after, there was still no update. People were speculating like, oh my gosh, was she doxxed? Was she hacked? What's happening here? She hasn't said anything herself. Not too long after, she came out and addressed the full situation with an extended video. And, people obviously clicked on that and wanted to figure out what juice did I miss out. But as it turns out, in this extended video, after the scene that everyone had watched, the picture on the screen, the frame, zoomed out to show that this was entirely filmed in a studio setting with a professional crew. And it was all staged in a bid for us to learn about a campaign. So you see in the original video, in the heat of the moment, Holly Jean had let out a line that was basically a line of a Durex campaign. And she was teaching young people about how even in the heat of the moment, there is time to negotiate putting on protection or negotiating your options, how to take care of yourself. Don't feel like it's too late. Now, because the first video had gone so viral and everyone assumed it was scandalous, when she announced there was a follow-up, people listened, people watched, and the message got through. And this was unintentionally massive sexual education as sponsored by a condom brand.
Yeah.
It was also happening, in the climate of young people still debating online about where to get this information. Is it through forums, through friends who may not know any better, through schools who might sometimes have preferences about politics and what they say and what they share? So incidentally, after this, many other influencers have followed the same route in partnership with brands, with services, with organizations that teach young people, not just about sexuality, but about development as a whole. They started using these sorts of racy, initially controversial hooks to get people interested, and then to serve us the message.
Well, in your opinion, do you think this is actually rather more damaging than educational in regards to, teaching sex education? I mean, from a marketing perspective, I can imagine that was a very big successful project for them. But knowing that youths are less likely to do more research, and in fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of the people who are viewing that video of Holly were maybe a little bit disappointed after they consume this sort of content that influencers post. Do you think this is bad, or do you think it's actually the right way to go?
So in the time when this incident went viral in the mid-2010s, this was controversial, yes, but also brand new. It was at a time where young people did not have as much access to information and resources as they do now. A lot of the conversations have developed in the last 10 years or so. The overwhelming response to this whole campaign was that while racy and while borderline controversial, this was a brand new modality to get the message out to young people. And young people paid attention and they listened. So the overall take-home message from this is, you know what? Young people are probably going to search through websites to look for information. They're probably not going to ask their parents or ask their teachers, but they are most definitely 100% going to hear what influencers have to say, which is why it's quite important for us to point out when these are successful, good case studies with a message worth taking. And then also to call out when sometimes influencers push things too far, and it's hard for younger followers to discern whether or not that is a good moral message to take with them.
That's quite interesting. I was going to ask you a question in regards to, the influence that I want to go to the last question because if it's okay for you to say no to this question as well, but you're a person who studies influencers and social media in depth, and I have the pleasure of being your friend, but one thing I have noticed is that you're choosing not to release much about your personal life on your platforms, which is fine. It's not for everybody. But is this down to what you've studied and the negative side to social media? Or as a professional in the field, do you see this as an unprofessional move to be open on social media? But if you were to become an influencer, how would you approach this to influence others?
Oh, so many questions.
Yeah, sorry.
So I am very thoughtful about what I put out on the internet. In several of my other public talks, I've always been asked, are you an influencer? Do you perform in this way? And I always have to make it clear, no, I research influencers, but not for the purposes of becoming one. And because I research and study them, I am fully aware of what goes on behind the scenes, beyond the highlight reel, the longer term impacts on their lives, all the downsides they have to stomach, even just in general, the precarity that this comes with attached to your romantic life, your family life, your friendships, your daily functioning. The most basic thing that I often tell people and they get straight away is that as an influencer, you barely have time to switch off. Not posting an update for 3 days as a normal social media user, that's completely normal. But not doing that as an influencer is basically affecting your career in a very drastic manner. There is no downtime. I've known of influencers who have announced, I'm not updating this weekend because I'm going on a retreat. And to feel like you need to keep followers accountable that for 48 hours, there'll be no Insta stories, that tells you how online they are all the time. And, becoming an influencer is not something you can start and stop. Even if you're a small scale micro influencer, even if you retire one day, there will always be footprints. So in light of that context, I think I am quite clear and quite clean about what I've decided to put online, knowing that it might be there forever or decontextualized. But separate to that, I enjoy social media as a private citizen, not as like a public scholar. And I use those on my private accounts, on accounts with pseudonyms where people may not be able to track, so that I continue to enjoy the thing I study and not destroy my love as I turn it into a career in my research work. In general, I don't think we can just say, if you overshare, you're unprofessional, or if you're in some fields, you have to share to be professional. There is this general sentiment now, I think, with our cohorts, with Gen Z, that you need to be online to be findable in order for your employers to appreciate the work that you do. But it's not for everybody. I think it does have to suit your personality, whether you are comfortable recording yourself on screen or just audio, or you want to be a Luddite and not be online. So I would like if we continue to have options and not have extremely online as the default. Not at all unprofessional. In fact, kudos to those of us who are able to say, this is not for me. I'm not going to give in to peer pressure. I like what I'm doing. I won't overextend.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because you are seeing these days professionals in their job, whether it be doctors, whether it be professors, whether it be whoever in what we would consider high paying, high prestigious jobs, even creating their own Instagram, TikTok account in order to teach the world of what they do. But then there has been situations where I remember this is very popular doctor TikToker or influencer who was caught on a boat during the really deep COVID-19 situation where there was no parties, there was nothing. And he was part of a scandal as well because he's a doctor, he should be knowing better. So that oversharing situation of if you're going to be an influencer, you always have to be turned on, or someone's going to film you as well, and then you'll be exposed. It's a very fine line for, I guess, professionals in certain businesses. But I'm absolutely happy to talk to you today, Professor Crystal. And before you go, is there any events or studies that you want to promote? This is a great time for you to tell the listeners out there what you're doing.
I'm actually really excited and have the great honor of kicking off this IERLab series of podcasts. So thank you, Walter, for hosting us. I think this is one of our initiatives where we're trying to share our research to people, not from like a marketing and commercial media company perspective, but from people who are humanities and social scientists who are trying to explain some of these stereotypes or often quoted adages that we have about influencer cultures. To be clear, I don't think our approach is all celebratory. In fact, if you really dig down into it, a lot of the criticism runs deep, but we often point not just to the influencer, but to some structures in societies that have also constituted these sorts of behaviors. So for instance, these days, a hot topic would be TikTokers, who are the influencers filming themselves doing good deeds. But then in so doing, they're sort of involuntarily outing and putting on display, say, the homeless or the elderly that they're helping. So on the one hand, yeah, you've done a good deed. On the other hand, you're kind of exploiting someone in a vulnerable position to make your contents.
Yes.
And then we are now digging into the ethics of it. Is it okay just because you've assisted them financially one-off? But in the long run, are we trying to normalize that it's okay to exploit people because we see them as lesser, not required to give permissions, or we assume that because we've handed them help, they should be open to being shamed or recorded online? So what we're really trying to get at are these deeper, more macro questions using influencers as a springboard. And if there's anything to promote, it would be this podcast and all the upcoming episodes to be.
Excellent. So thank you so much. I mean, I actually can't wait to maybe talk with you again about that sort of subject deeper, because it's something that I also see on social media. And I also question, are they doing the right thing, or is it just for content purposes? Because, is there a follow-up with that person? Is there, if they're helping the homeless, are they doing it just as a one-off? It's a really interesting talk. But again, thank you for today's interesting and insightful talk. You can check out more work from Professor Crystal by going to wishcry.com. That's wish, W-I-S-H, cry.com, or IERLab.com. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the IERLab Podcast. Once again, thank you to today's guest, Professor Crystal. And until next time, this has been Walter Lee. You may click on your next adventure right now.